Let's look at Black's main plan and methods of play in the Sicilian Scheveningen variation. And Black's main plans are counterplay on the queen side, counterplay in the center, flank blow on the center with g5, transition to an endgame, simplifying maneuver of knight takes d4 and followed by bishop to c6, and also prophylactic maneuvers on the king side. So let us look at the counterplay on the queen side. Black's counterplay on the queen side is the pawn advance combined with the pressure along the c file. Here black goes bishop d7, and then now knight to b3, now b5, and then bishop f3, queen to c7, a3, rook b8, queen e1, a5, queen g3, and then a4. Now knight to d4, and now the knights are exchanged. Now b4, a b4, rook takes b4, knight to e2, short castle, bishop c3, rook c4, e5, de5, fe5, and knight to d5, bishop takes d5, queen c5 check, king h1, queen takes d5, knight f4, queen e4, rook a e1, queen takes c2, rook f2, queen f5, rook e f1, bishop c5, rook d2, bishop c6. And let us look at another example. Here black goes knight a5, doubling his pawns. Black opens the files on the queen side. Knight takes a5, b takes a5, b3, and now bishop b7, rook d1, rook fc8, and rook d3. Now bishop to a8, bishop d2, rook b4, f5, bishop f8, now fe6. So these are all typical maneuvers for the black on the queen side. And here in this example, black has a plan of a5, putting a5, and similar to the one from the Boleslavsky system. In response to a4, the black knight occupies the b4 square, attacking the c2 pawn and taking control of the d5 square. After this, a4, now knight to b4, bishop f3, bishop e6, king h1, queen c7, rook f2, rook fd8, rook d2, bishop c4, knight b5, bishop takes b5, a takes b5, a4, knight to c1, d5, fe5, knight takes e4, c3, knight takes d2, bishop takes d2, and now queen takes e5. This was played between Karpov and Spassky in 1974. Now here in this example, all the same, the plan of a5 is quite risky, as the weakening of the black queen side may be revealed. Hereafter a5, a4, knight b4, and bishop f3, bishop c6, knight to d4, g6, rook f2, e5, knight takes c6, b takes c6, fe5, de5, and queen to f1, queen c8, h3, knight d7, bishop g4, h5, bishop takes d7, queen takes d7, queen c4, bishop h4, rook d2, queen e7, rook f1, rook fd8, knight b1, queen b7, king h2, king g7, c3, knight a6, rook e2, rook f8, knight to d2, bishop d8, knight to f3, f6, rook d2, bishop e7, queen e6, and then rook a d8, rook takes d8 and bishop takes d8, rook d1, knight b8, bishop c5, rook h8, rook takes d8. and and now let us look at some examples on the counterplay in the center. One of the methods of black's counterplay is the advance of d5. It is especially efficient in response to flank attack of g4. Here, after white puts g4, black goes d5, ed5, knight takes d4, queen takes d4, bishop c5, queen c4, ed5, knight takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, bishop c6, bishop f3, queen d7, queen c3, queen takes g4, and bishop takes c6, rook takes c6, queen f3, queen takes f3, rook takes f3, rook d2, rook d3, rook d6, rook c3, rook 6 d5, and rook e1, f6, rook e8 check, king f7, rook b8, rook e2, rook takes b7 check, king e6, rook d3, and rook takes d3, rook takes c takes d3, and rook takes b2, and black is winning here. And in this example, playing d5, black must worry about the white advance of e5. In this case, white may obtain good chances to occupy the d4 square and to attack the black king. After d5, black plays e5, then knight to e4, bishop takes and d takes e4, queen f2, b5, ab5, knight d4, bishop c6, queen g3, rook takes a1, rook takes a1, rook b8, f5, ef5, knight f5, and bishop f8, bishop f4, rook a8, rook c1, g6, e6, queen b7, e7, bishop g7, knight takes g7, king takes g7, and queen h4, f6, queen h6 check, king g8, bishop d6. So here in this example, after d5 and e5, black should try to avoid blocking of the center. For this, he often sacrifices a pawn, activating the b7 bishop. Here, after d5 and e5, now d4 is played, and knight takes d4, knight takes d4, bishop takes d4, rook e d8, bishop e3, queen c6, rook f3, b3, ef6, b takes c2, queen f1, rook takes d3, queen takes d3, and c1 queens, rook takes c1, queen takes c1, rook f1, queen c6, and this was played between Morozovich and Belikov in 92. And in this example here, to make the d5 advance more efficient, black frequently makes a preliminary move of e5. This prevents white from pushing e5 advance in response to d5. So black himself pushes e5, and now knight g3, now d5 is played, and here black has the initiative. Here black puts e5, and now white goes f5, and this is a serious strategic mistake which unleashes black's hands for carrying out the d5 breakthrough. With white pawn on f5, it is even stronger, as black would create the passed e pawn. White should have played fe5 and de5. After knight e7, king h1, rook fe8, queen g5 and d5. Now knight to d2, king h8, rook f3, rook a d8, queen h4, queen b6, e d5, knight e takes d5, knight takes d5, bishop takes d5, and rook f e3, queen c6, knight e4, knight takes e4, bishop takes e4, and f6, rook d3, bishop takes e4, queen takes e4, queen takes e4 and rook takes e4, rook takes d3, c d3, rook d8, and rook e3, rook d4. Another way of attacking the white center is a blow of e5 followed by play on the dark squares. After e5, knight b3, ef4, rook f4, and knight to e8, queen d2, bishop f6, rook f2, bishop e5, bishop g5, and knight to f6. Here you can see black deals a flank blow of playing g5 himself. He plays g5 for g4, now h4, gf4, bishop f4, h5, g5, knight g4, bishop takes g4, hg4, king f2, knight e5, bishop takes e5, d takes e5, king g3, bishop c5, king takes g4, bishop d4, rook ad1, bishop takes e3, knight takes e3, f5 check, gf6, rook g8, king h3, queen takes c3. The advance of g5 is possible even when black castles kingside. In this position, Kasparov recommends g5, and after fg5, knight fd7 with compensation for the material at the cost of a pawn. Black conquered the d5 square here. So as you can see, black's pawn, white's pawn structure is compromised. and the d5 square is black has conquered the d5 square. The Sicilian endgame is usually favorable for black. This fact is explained by peculiarities of the pawn structure, which dictates white's plan of active play in the center and attack on the king side. In the endgame, however, black's positional pressure on the queen side becomes a more significant factor. So you can see the game. Sometimes the endgame uh, turns out to be in white's favor. So let's look at the simplifying maneuver of knight takes d4 followed by bishop c6. Uh, Simplification is to black's favor as he possesses less space. Here, a typical method in the d4 knight's retreat from the center, preventing the simplification, but still one should know a subtlety here. After knight b3, the standard move is premature. After a6, a4, b6, f4, queen c7, bishop d3, bishop b7, queen f3, knight b4, knight d4, g6. And white should only retreat his d4 knight from the center only if black has played bishop to d7. After f4, bishop d7, knight b3, a6, a4, b6, bishop f3, queen c7, queen e2, bishop to e8. It is necessary to vacate the d7 square for the f6 knight. After g4, now knight to d7, g5, and now knight to c5, bishop g2 with initiative. So let us look at some prophylactic maneuvers on the king side. Here g4, after g4 bishop to c8 is played, vacating the d7 square for the f6 knight and transferring the bishop to b7, and now g5, knight d7, queen f2 and bishop f8. Black is going to move his bishop to g7 to consolidate his king side. Later an attack of white's major pieces on the h7 square may be repelled by simply putting knight to f8. Beside bishop's withdrawal from the e file activates the e8 rook. Now bishop g2, bishop b7, rook ad1, g6, bishop c1, rook b c8, rook d3, knight b4, rook h3, bishop g7, knight bishop e3, and now rook e7. A beautiful preventive maneuver defending the f7 square and concentrating his major pieces along the e file. Black diminishes an effect of the f5 advance. Here after king g1, rook ce8, rook d1, f5, gf6, knight f6, rook g3, and rook f7, bishop takes b6, queen b8, bishop e3, knight h5, rook g4, knight f6, rook h4, g5, fg5, knight g4, queen d2, knight takes e3, queen takes e3 and knight takes c2, queen b6, bishop a8, rook takes d6, rook b7, queen takes a6, rook takes b3, rook takes e6 and rook takes b2, queen c4, king h8, e5, queen a7 check, king h1, bishop takes g2 check, king takes g2 and knight d4 check. A similar defensive rearrangement of pieces helps black in the extremely sharp Velimirovic attack in the chosen variation. Rook fc8, rook g3, knight e5, bishop takes and knight takes, knight takes e7, queen takes e7, bishop d4, b4, knight a4, knight c4, b3, knight a3, c4, bc3, knight b6, knight b5, bishop f6, queen c7, and as you can see the game, and there are typical positional sacrifices. As you can see, there is the typical rook takes c3 exchange sacrifice, and this is a typical reaction to a premature move of g6. The f5 push sometimes involves a sacrifice on the e4 pawn, As you can see, the e4 pawn is sacrificed, and after fg6, bishop takes g6, there is rook takes f6, exchange sack. After bishop takes f6, there is knight d5, and after queen d8, there is bishop to b6, bishop d3, losing control of the h5 square. After e5, fe5, knight h5, a standard method, sacrificing a pawn. Black begins to play on the dark squares. And here black has compensation for the material. So that's all, guys. These are all the black's plans and typical maneuvers. So thank you all.